For the American infantryman in Vietnam, the war was rarely the thing he had imagined before he arrived. It was not a line of trenches or a fixed front to be pushed forward mile by mile. It was walking, endless, grinding, sweat-soaked walking through country that seemed designed to punish anyone who tried to cross it on foot. The Grunts had a word for it. They called it humping the Boonies, and it described the central fact of their existence more honestly than any official phrase could. A rifleman might spend weeks in the field for every hour of actual contact. The rest of the time he carried a crushing load through jungle, hill, and flooded paddy, in heat that never let up, hunting an enemy who usually chose whether a fight would happen at all. To understand the war the average grunt fought, you have to understand a walk. This is the first thing to understand about the infantry war. The soldier's greatest daily adversary was not always the enemy. It was gravity, terrain, and climate working in concert against a body carrying half its own weight, and the terrain gave no quarter. In the highlands and along the coastal ranges, the jungle grew in layers, a triple canopy where the tallest trees rose over 100 feet and choked off the sunlight, leaving the floor in permanent green shadow. Beneath the canopy, the undergrowth could be so thick that a point man might hack forward with a machete for hours and advance only a few hundred yards. Movement in that country was measured not in miles, but in effort. The triple canopy imposed its own disorientation. Under a ceiling of leaves that blotted out the sun, a soldier lost his easy sense of direction and time, and the heat gathered beneath the greenery with nowhere to go. Navigation fell to map, compass, and dead reckoning, counting paces across ground where a straight line was almost never possible, and small errors compounded over a day's march. The word jungle, in fact, was thrown around so loosely that it lost precision. Men fresh from a fight would describe impossibly dense jungle that turned out on inspection to be nothing worse than the heaviest bush they had yet pushed through. The useful measure was not how much sunlight came through the canopy, but how much the growth slowed a man down. Where troops could walk at a slow pace and each man could see 3 or 4 others without bunching, with a view around him of perhaps 60 to 100 feet, that was not true jungle, however tall the trees. Real jungle was the matted tangle of vines, clumped bamboo, and thorn that cut forward movement to something like a few hundred yards in an hour, ground a unit could cross only by hacking part of the way through it. Where the jungle thinned, other obstacles took over. The hills of the central regions were steep, root-tangled and slick with mud through much of the year, and climbing them under a full load turned a routine march into an ordeal that left strong men gasping. Descending was scarcely better, because a heavy ruck pitched a man forward on the downslopes and turned every wet root and loose stone into a chance for a fall. In the lowlands and the delta, the rice paddies presented a different problem. A grunt crossing paddy country waded through knee-deep or waist-deep water and clinging mud, balancing along the narrow raised dikes that separated one flooded field from the next. Those dikes were exposed ground, and every soldier learned to distrust them, because an enemy who wanted to channel a patrol into a killing zone could count on men taking the easiest path. Then there was elephant grass, which deserves its reputation. Growing in dense stands up to 10 or 12 feet tall, with edges sharp enough to slice skin, it blocked sight and airflow at once, trapping heat and cutting a man's world down to the few feet around him. Over all of it lay the climate. The lowlands were tropical, with daytime temperatures that regularly climbed into the upper 90s, and humidity that made the air feel like a wet blanket. Then came the monsoon, which soaked the country for months at a stretch, turning trails to mud, filling the paddies, and ensuring that a soldier in the field was almost never dry. The combination of heat, exertion, and load produced its own steady toll. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke were constant threats, and dehydration stalked any unit that lost its water discipline. The land itself did much of the enemy's work. The scale of the physical demand is worth stating plainly. A rifleman carried between 60 and 90 pounds, sometimes more for the men burdened with the radio and the crew-served weapons. Daytime temperatures in the lowlands climbed past 95 degrees, with humidity to match. The monsoon soaked the country for months at a time, and a hard day's movement through jungle or paddy might cover only a mile or two of actual ground for all the effort it consumed. Those were the baseline conditions of infantry life, present before the enemy entered the equation at all. One point deserves perspective, because the imagination tends to run ahead of the reality. For all its miseries, the jungle was not the menagerie of lethal wildlife that popular fear made it out to be. Snake bites did happen, dozens a year across the force, from vipers and kraits that earned their own grim nicknames, and swift helicopter medical evacuation kept most of them from turning fatal. But set against the thousands of non-combat deaths from accidents, drowning and disease, deaths from snakes or animals were a small share. In the concentrated set of fighting operations that Army historians reconstructed through after-action interviews, none of the deaths traced to wildlife at all, and the lone fatality charged to the jungle itself came from a falling tree during a clearing operation. The real dangers of the Boonies were mundane and cumulative, the weight and the heat and the wet, not the dramatic hazards a soldier might have braced himself for. None of this was intuitive to the new man. The soldier arriving in his unit for the first time, fresh from stateside training and a long flight, was almost useless in the Boonies until the field taught him what the training could not. Learning to hump began with the load he had just been handed. Packing a rucksack was a skill. Weight had to be balanced and kept high and close to the back, because a badly packed ruck shifted with every step and multiplied fatigue, dragging a man off balance on narrow dikes and steep slopes. Veterans taught newcomers what to carry and, more importantly, what to leave behind, because every ounce of comfort was an ounce that had to be humped up the next hill. Water discipline was the lesson that could not be learned too fast. A man sweating through a tropical march lost staggering amounts of fluid, and the temptation was to drink freely early, then run dry hours before the next resupply. Seasoned soldiers rationed their canteens, drank on a schedule rather than on impulse, and treated groundwater with halazone tablets that killed most of what lived in it, though never enough to make it taste like anything but chemicals. Dysentery and other intestinal illnesses circulated constantly, and a man who drank from a paddy without treating it might spend the following days weak and cramping, still expected to hump his load. Much of this knowledge passed by word of mouth, from the men who had already survived a few months in the field to the ones who had just arrived. The new man was untested, his habits still wrong, and until he proved he could hump his load and hold his place in the column without endangering anyone, the veterans watched him closely. The stakes were immediate. A man who packed badly slowed the march, a man who ran out of water became everyone's problem, and a man who could not keep the pace forced the whole column to accommodate him. The pressure to adapt came as much from the other grunts as from any instruction. Rations demanded their own discipline. The C ration case was heavy, and the individual meals, sealed in cans, forced a soldier to weigh how much food was worth its weight against everything else he carried. Men learned to break down the cases, discard the packaging, and distribute the cans through the ruck to balance the load. They learned which meals were tolerable and which were traded away or buried, and some carried hot sauce or other small additions to make the monotony survivable. The calories mattered because a grunt burning through a hard day's march needed fuel, and the field offered no other source. Then there were the feet, which in the infantry were a tactical concern, not a matter of comfort. A soldier whose feet failed could not walk, and a soldier who could not walk was a casualty and a burden on his squad. Constant immersion in paddy water and the endless soaking of the monsoon produced immersion foot, a painful breakdown of the skin that could put a man out of action as surely as a wound. Veterans preached the ritual: change socks whenever possible, air the feet during halts, dust them with foot powder, keep dry pairs sealed in plastic. It was one of the few defenses a grunt had against an injury the terrain inflicted for free. Pacing was the subtler skill. The new man wanted to charge, to prove himself, to keep up by force of will. The experienced soldier moved at a sustainable rhythm, conserving energy, reading the ground, understanding that the march would last far longer than any burst of enthusiasm could carry him. He learned to use the terrain rather than fight it, to plant his feet deliberately on slick slopes and shorten his stride in the mud, and over weeks the Boonies rebuilt his body. Men arrived soft and grew hard, shedding weight, building the specific endurance that came only from carrying heavy loads over broken ground, day after day. It was not a training program, it was survival adapting the body to what it was required to do, and there was no shortcut through it. Once a man could hump, he entered the daily rhythm of life on the move, and that rhythm belonged to the squad and the platoon. It was at this level, a few dozen men at most, that the war was actually walked. A typical day began before dawn. The unit had spent the night in a defensive position and broke it at first light, the men rolling their poncho liners and shouldering their rucks in the half-light. Then the platoon moved, and the way it moved was governed by a logic every grunt absorbed. The order of movement was deliberate. A patrol did not walk in a bunch because a bunched formation invited catastrophe. Men spread out in a column so that a single burst of fire or a single mine could not cut down the whole unit at once. At the front walked the point man, whose job was the most dangerous in the platoon. He moved ahead of everyone, reading the trail for the disturbed earth or the length of fishing line that might mark a booby trap, choosing the route through country that offered 100 places for an ambush to wait. It was a role that exhausted the men who filled it, and for that reason the point was rotated at intervals of no more than an hour, both to keep the lead man sharp and to share the labor of breaking trail. Ahead of the point squad, scouts moved at set distances, 30 and 60 feet forward when visibility allowed, serving as the column's tripwire. Behind the point came the slack man, backing him up, and then the rest of the column, with the platoon leader and his radio operator positioned to control the movement and the machine gunners spaced to bring their fire to bear. Tail-end security watched the rear. The main trails through the bush ran narrow, often no more than 3.5 feet wide except where they met, and on ground like that, a unit had no choice but single file. That discipline was not only about speed. Strung out in a proper single file, each man's body shielded the men behind him from fire coming up the trail, and the hard experience of the war had shown what happened when a column let itself bunch. In one incident during a large operation, a single command detonated mine set in a tree killed or wounded 26 men strung along roughly 130 feet of trail, and the toll owed much to a column that had closed up too tightly on a wide path. The spacing was a constant negotiation with the terrain. In thick jungle, the intervals tightened so men could keep one another in sight, which raised the danger if a mine or an ambush caught the column. In open country, they could stretch, but then control grew harder. Every formation was a compromise, adjusted continuously by soldiers who had learned to read the ground for what it offered the enemy. Behind the tactics lay a discipline that governed everything. The discipline of silence and invisibility. In country where the enemy might be anywhere, sound carried, and a careless soldier could give away a whole unit. Men taped down anything that rattled, muffled their gear, and moved and communicated with hand signals and low voices. At night the rule tightened. No open flame, no cigarette, no flashlight that might draw fire from a tree line. Some seasoned patrols banned smoking outright, on the reasoning that it dulled a man's sense of smell, and smell was one of the ways a unit detected the enemy before seeing him. The infantry spent enormous effort simply trying not to be detected, an implicit acknowledgement that in this war the enemy often held the initiative, and that a patrol's survival could depend on passing through the Boonies without announcing itself. Movement stopped for rest halts, and those halts followed their own etiquette. When the column paused, men did not simply flop down in the open. They moved off the trail, faced outward, and covered the surrounding terrain, weapons ready, because a halt was a moment of vulnerability. During longer breaks, a soldier might slip off his ruck, and the relief of that weight coming off the shoulders was one of the few pure pleasures the field offered. He might eat, tend his feet, or drink on his schedule. Before settling in for the night, a well-run unit would beat out the nearby ground, sending small patrols in a cloverleaf pattern to check for any enemy lying close. A variation the Australians favored, the button hook, had a column curl back on its own path to ambush anyone following it. On paper, this precaution was standard, and commanders up the chain insisted it always happened. In practice, analysis of more than 100 company actions showed that the average junior leader often gave the principal only lip service, and that carelessness on the trail was among the most common ways units walked into trouble. Then the word came to saddle up, the rucks went back on, and the march resumed, its destination often unclear to the individual rifleman. Resupply structured the longer rhythm of field life, and it came almost entirely by helicopter. The utility helicopters that ferried men and material, the ubiquitous Hueys, were the lifeline that made prolonged operations in the Boonies possible at all. Every few days the platoon would secure a landing zone, sometimes hacking one out of the jungle with explosives and machetes, and wait for the birds to bring in water, ammunition, rations, and mail. Resupply days were a small relief, though the load never got lighter for long, because a full resupply meant a full ruck to hump away from the landing zone. The dependence was total. When weather grounded the birds, a unit in the field could find itself short of water and ammunition with no ground route to fall back on. The physical torments of the march ran alongside the tactical ones. The heat has already been described, but its effect on a moving column bears repeating, because men dropped from it, and a unit had to manage its pace and its water against the constant risk of heat casualties. The insects were a torment of their own. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds, carrying malaria that put more men in the hospital than many would have guessed, which is why the anti-malarial pill was a mandatory ritual and insect repellent a treasured commodity. And then there were the leeches, which occupy a particular place in the memory of anyone who humped the wet country. They dropped from foliage and rose out of the paddy water, swelling with blood before a man even noticed them. Grunts burned them off with a cigarette or repellent and checked themselves and each other for the ones that had crept into places out of sight. The wet environment also produced jungle rot, the general term for the skin ailments that flourished on bodies kept perpetually damp and pushed daily through thorn and abrasive growth. It tended to open on the hands and forearms where the bush scraped them, sores that festered and refused to close in the humidity. Yet by the reckoning of the men who suffered it, jungle rot was mostly a passing affliction. Most who got it did not bother to leave the field over it. They bandaged the sores while afield and let a few days of sun and dry air clear them up back at base. The leeches earned the same weary tolerance. Men endured them, joked about them, knowing the discomfort would pass. Taken together, the heat, the insects, the leeches, and the rot meant the environment was steadily wearing on every man in the field, even when no enemy was present. Attrition in the Boonies was constant and quiet, and it never appeared in any battle report. At the end of each day's march came the digging in. As the light faded, the platoon halted at a chosen night position, usually defensible ground, and prepared to hold it through the dark. The rule experience had beaten into the infantry was to stop early enough to organize the position in daylight, because a unit still scratching out its holes as darkness fell was acutely vulnerable. Men paired off and dug foxholes deep enough to protect against fire and against the mortar rounds that might come in the night. How deep mattered enormously. After one night defense that absorbed a heavy mortar barrage, a sergeant explained why his unit came through it by saying they had dug in right up to their chins, and close questioning confirmed it was no exaggeration. The two-man foxhole was the standard, and the buddy system it created had value beyond companionship, steadying a man's nerve and keeping one set of eyes open while the other rested. The claymores came out, set facing outward along the likely approaches, though men learned to watch them, because the enemy had a habit of crawling forward in the dark to cut the wires or turn a mine around to face its owners. Listening posts went out, and the position stood to at dusk and dawn, the likeliest hours for attack. Through the night, roughly a third of the men stayed awake behind their weapons on a rotating watch, while the others took what sleep the ground and the tension allowed. Sleep, when it came, was shallow. Before first light, the whole unit came awake, stood to, and then with the sun, packed up and began the walk again. What that cycle demanded, more than physical strength, was mental endurance. The strength could be built, and the field built it. The harder thing was the grind itself, the psychological weight of doing this day after day, with no clear front, no ground gained that stayed gained, and no way to know when a quiet trail would erupt into contact. The infantryman lived inside a peculiar tension, long stretches of exhausting boredom punctuated by moments of sudden violence, with no control over when the switch would flip. He humped through country that offered no landmarks of progress, secured ground he would abandon the next morning, and returned weeks later to walk the same hills again. Enduring the monotony and the uncertainty without breaking was the real test of the Boonie grunt. The men who lasted learned to narrow their world to the next step, the next halt, the next resupply. Humping the Boonies was never the war the public pictured, and it was rarely the war the Grunt had pictured either. It was the substance of infantry service in Vietnam, the thing that filled the vast majority of a rifleman's days, and it exacted its price whether or not a shot was ever fired. The load, the terrain, and the climate together formed an environment that ground men down steadily and impersonally. And the enemy, when he appeared, was often the shorter part of the ordeal. To have humped the Boonies was to have carried the weight of the war on your own 2 feet, mile after uncounted mile, through country that punished every one of them.